Next at 7 o'clock, Timeline with Carol Sikorsky. We'll be looking into Valley schools that specialize in teaching our deaf to function in today's society. At 8, One by One. At 9, Mystery, tonight on Channel 18, KMTF Fresno.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. Centuries ago, Aristotle incorrectly declared that deaf people were uneducable and retarded. And as a result, no one tried to educate deaf people until the 16th century, when a monk in France learned to teach them by using their own natural sign language. Well, the deaf community has come a long way since that first teaching lesson in France. But if you listen to the news and read the headlines today, deaf people all over the country are still struggling to prove their point, that they can live independently from the hearing community. And just because that they may be deaf, that does not mean that they are handicapped. A prime example of their struggle could be seen in Washington, D.C. this past March, when students and faculty from Gallaudet University protested the appointment of a hearing person as the 7th president of the university. In the school's 124-year existence, they had never elected a deaf president. My panel tonight consists of only 2 hearing people. The other 4 guests are deaf. My interpreter for my guest and our viewing audience is Brian Riley. Throughout the show, you'll hear him interpret the comments from the panel. As well, you'll see him sign my questions and answers to our guests. Tonight we'll talk about how a deaf person succeeds in today's competitive world. When does the education of a deaf child begin? And how is it continued through high school and college? Are deaf students getting the best possible education? And how and who is teaching them? Also, what about life after graduation? How does a deaf person interview for a job, let's say? Do employers discriminate, thinking the job can get done more efficiently by someone else? Hopefully, my guests can answer some of these questions, and I would like to introduce them to you now. First to my right is Steve Silverman, and Steve is the board president, the current board president of VACC. And with Steve tonight, if you can see on the floor sleeping, is Obi. He's pretty quiet. That's his hearing dog, and thank you, Steve, for being here with us this evening. Next to Steve Silverman is Pam Warkentine, and Pam works at the Vocational Management Service here in Fresno. And she is also vice president of the board at Valley Advocacy and Communication Center. And she's also the daughter of 2 deaf parents. And Pam, thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
Next to Pam is Dr. Paul Ogden. Dr. Ogden is a professor of communicative disorders at Fresno State University. And Dr. Ogden is also the author of a book, one called The Silent Garden, which gives advice to hearing parents of deaf children. We'll be talking a little bit about that with you. Thank you, Dr. Ogden, for being here with us this evening also. Next to Dr. Ogden is Leticia Dominguez. Leticia is going to be a freshman at Gallaudet University this fall in Washington, and she is also a graduate of the California School for the Deaf at Fremont. And Leticia, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Next to Leticia is Diane Beauregard. Diane is program specialist for special ed in the Fresno Unified School District, and she has been with the program for approximately 14 years, and we appreciate you being here with us this evening also. And interpreting, or not interpreting, but signing for Diane this evening will be Kathy Yoshida, who is sitting behind her there. And Kathy is a staff interpreter at VACC, and thank you, Kathy, for being here. And then finally, on the end is David Eberwein. David is a sophomore, or will be a sophomore, correct, at Fremont High School in the fall. And David has been completely deaf from birth, and both of his parents and his sister are deaf, and we'll be talking a little bit about about the education he's receiving at Fremont. So to start out tonight's program, I think I would like to direct my first question to Diane Beauregard. We mentioned in the intro we're talking a lot about education and exactly when education starts for a deaf child. Do we see it in the early years as soon as, 2 or 3, 4 years of age before the child gets into school?
Well, as soon as they're diagnosed, really what happens is someone will notice that the child is hearing impaired possibly, and usually they will take them to an audiologist or ear, nose, and throat specialist, and then to an audiologist and get tested. If they decide that the child is hearing impaired, a lot of times they're referred to the school district for services. Our special classes for hearing impaired start at 18 months old. However, there are services for even younger from birth on if the child should need it. And so it's when you start thinking about sending your child to school as early as 18 months old, you're sending this little baby. And a lot of times the parents choose to come with them for the first few days.
It seems like a problem there might be the fact that diagnosing a child at such an early age, sometimes they may take the child to their doctor, and the doctor may not know that the child is deaf and may mistake it for a disability and just say the child is a slow developer. Do you find that as a problem?
I think that happens. I think modern technology, we're such a long ways away from years ago in terms of technology and the diagnostic work that we're able to do today. But you still do hear about the stories, unfortunately, where parents have gone from this person said, I think my child can't hear, or something was wrong, and the doctor says, don't worry. Your child's just slow in developing, they'll learn to talk a little bit later. And so you do see that happening. Although they do have tests now that as infants, right after they're born, they can give a test to see whether or not there is some hearing there or not.
Okay. Letitia, I'd like to direct my next question to you. I mentioned when I introduced you that you were deaf from birth, but you told me that both your parents are hearing. Is that correct?
That's right. My parents are hearing.
Okay, now, tell us a little bit about your situation. Did your parents know right away that you were deaf? Did you get diagnosed right away?
Well, I'm from a large family, and one of my oldest brothers, I have 8 sisters and 3 brothers, and the first oldest brother is slightly hard of hearing. He can speak well, and he has to practice in order to listen well. But I assume that they found out about his hearing impairment first. Then I have another sister who uses hearing aids and talks well, doesn't sign too much. She's more of an oral type of a deaf person. And I have another deaf sister who can sign. She went to the residential school. And of course, I don't speak at all. And so it was easy for my mother to identify me as being deaf.
But when you first started your education, were you, let's say when you went to kindergarten or first grade, right away were you with students that could hear, or were you with all students that were deaf?
Yeah. From what I know, my mother placed me in a deaf class, in a deaf school. I assume that she might have put me with hearing kids and found out that I couldn't hear, and then put me with a smaller class of deaf students in Tulare. That's the track that I went in Tulare School. And that changed to the William Kleinite Center for the Deaf in Tulare. And now my deaf sister, my mother at first thought she was hearing and put her in the hearing school, found out she was deaf, so put her into the same deaf school that I went to.
So obviously with a family of your size, it was a lot of education just within your family nucleus. I mean, you all had to learn from each other as far as being able to communicate both for your parents that could hear and for you who would have to learn how to read lips or sign language, I assume that was a lot of education that went on just amongst all of you.
Yes. When I was a child, I didn't really speak. My brothers and sisters tried to teach me how to lip read, and now they themselves don't sign that well. I speak a little bit at home and use some home signs, we call them, gestures that we make up to communicate.
Okay. Pam, I'd like to talk with you next because your situation is exactly the opposite of Letitia's. Now, you are the daughter of two deaf parents.
Right.
I don't even know where to begin with questions. How did you learn to communicate to your parents and vice versa?
When I was born, it wasn't long after I was born that my parents and the doctors had decided that I was not deaf. That was an initial concern for my parents. And after that, they were still determined that I would have to learn sign language to communicate with them. Although my mother does have some speech, I was the oldest child, and she signed with my father in communicating because my father does not have intelligible speech. So what I was exposed to from birth was signing, and that's what I learned. I think my first sign was the word clock at the time I was 7 months old. And I learned to sign prior to learning to speak. And I didn't really start speaking until probably after about a year old. My mother's parents were both hearing and lived close by, so they would come over and communicate with me to encourage conversation. But even at the age of 4, when my mother brought me to the doctor and just an annual check, they discovered that I had a lot of vocabulary. They could see I was communicating through my signs, but I still wasn't vocalizing as much, I guess, as a hearing child of hearing parents would be vocalizing at that age. So the state paid for my parents to send me to a nursery school that would encourage my communication and verbal skills. And from the neighborhood children, and the rest of the communication just kind of flowed together.
Right. Because being in that type of setting, growing up, what was normal for you was to sign.
Right.
And the fact that your parents could not hear, that wasn't unusual to you. So vocalizing yourself to not vocalize wasn't unusual.
Right. I think, I don't remember it all, but from discussions with my parents, I think I did not recognize that my parents were different than other parents until I went into school and actually had to begin interpreting for my parents when they wanted to communicate with the teacher. It wasn't until that point. I guess I just assumed that everyone else used sign language too. That was my world.
Right. Now, was that, as a child growing up, was that hard for you once you realized that your parents were different?
No, I think I always felt special because I was always a part of everything they were involved in, including parent-teacher conferences. Everything that they did, I was there because that was before professional interpreters were developed, and so I was there as their interpreter. And so I always felt a part of their lives. I never felt resentful or like it was a difficult, challenging situation for me.
Okay, David, let's talk a little bit about your background first. Now, both of your parents are deaf, and your sister is deaf, and you were born deaf. So from the very beginning, you learned how to communicate with your parents. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, do you remember first learning to communicate with your parents, and how did you first communicate with them? How did they teach you to communicate within the family?
Well, That was my natural mode of communication with my parents. Hearing parents always talk to their hearing baby, right? But deaf parents always sign to their deaf children. And they were always pointing out objects and telling me what the sign was for this sofa and whatnot. And my father took me to the zoo and showed me signs for all of the animals. And we had a good time with that. And they always talked with me. My mother always talked with me, even when it was story time. We would read and sign at the same time and look at the pictures. So it was great communication with my parents. They were always there for me and always talking with me all the time. And so when I went to school, I found out that teachers have different ways to sign, and I had to learn how to talk with other hearing students by writing notes and whatnot, and they would see my parents. I would see my parents writing notes with hearing people, so I learned to do the same.
Now, did your parents know right away that you were deaf? I mean, obviously that must have been a concern when you were born, I think, wasn't it? So did they find that out right away that you were deaf?
Oh, yes. By the time I was home, they were already clapping their hands behind my head and seeing if I was responding to noises and whatnot. But I never responded to any of them like a hearing child would, so they just decided I was deaf.
Okay, now before we get a little bit more into your background and your education, I would like to next go to Steve and talk with Steve a little bit. Now, Steve, you had hearing until 4 years ago. Tell us, if you would like, what happened.
I grew up hearing until I was 28. The doctors discovered that I had tumors on both of my hearing nerves. One of my ears was already functionally dead. When I went into surgery for the other one, my left ear, the doctor let me know that it was very possible I would lose a lot and maybe all in my left ear. I lost a lot when he removed part of the tumor. That was 4.5 years ago.
Now your family, that not only for yourself, but for your family, your wife, and do you have children that?
Yes, I have a wife and 3 children.
Okay. Now, what the adjustment? I mean, how did you all adjust to that? Because all of a sudden you're put into a different, I don't want to say culture, I don't know if that's the proper word, but all of a sudden you're in a world that you were never in before. So how did you personally adjust to that, and how did your family learn to adjust to that?
It was a hard adjustment. My family suffered, struggled with becoming used to their new daddy and husband, and now succeeded. That whole process took about 1.5 years. I had to leave my job. I was a teacher in elementary school, and the State Department of Voc Rehab paid for me to go back to school and finish my credential for teaching deaf children. That happened. I completed that process last year. My family was very supportive. In fact, my parents are now learning to sign themselves.
Now tell us about Obi. I don't know if we can see Obi here. He's kind of snoozing. This is your hearing dog. Now, I think when people usually see a dog with someone, they think of a blind person using a dog, but this is a dog for the hearing. And tell us how, I don't want to say how you use Obi, but if you want to put him in the picture, you can.
Obi was,
There he is.
come,
There.
good boy.
He's tired. He was sleeping.
Obi was trained at the San Francisco SPCA Hearing Dogs program. I'm his second deaf owner. He came into my life about 8 months ago, and he just recently became 5 years old himself. He helps me if a person knocks at the door. He will run to get me and run back to the door and back and forth. And I know that means to follow him, that a person is there. He also will notify me if the telephone is ringing or if the smoke alarm is going on. And really, he's a big benefit to me. He really helps me know that I'm involved in what's going on in the house, that I don't have to depend on the hearing people in my house.
So he probably was helpful for your family, too. And they gained a pet, didn't they?
That's right.
Yeah.
He's not really a pet to my family. He gets along with my children and is very tolerant when my 2-year-old does 2-year-old things to him. But really, he belongs to me, and I take care of him.
Okay, now, Dr. Ogden, I also know, because Steve told me earlier tonight that you also have a dog, a hearing dog. How long have you had your dog?
Well, I've had her 3 years, and I left her at home tonight so she can babysit my wife.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about your background. We mentioned that you're a professor at Fresno State, but before that, you received your doctorate in psychology of deafness at the University of Illinois in Champaign. And let's go back a little bit farther. Let's go back to your high school days, or even prior to that, grade school days. Now, were you born deaf?
Yes. I don't even know what I'm missing. I've never heard any sounds in my life. I was born deaf, yes, to my parents' surprise. But they also had another child who was deaf, so they had 11 years of practice with him before I came along. So they were ready to provide full communication. Which makes me rather unique, actually, compared to other families. My parents are hearing, but they already knew what to do, and the communications started very early. So I'm very fortunate that I was able to go on to a good private school, and then in high school I was mainstreamed into a hearing high school. I was the only deaf person there. It was very tough, because there was no interpreters there or anything.
Okay, I want to ask you about that, and we're going to talk a little bit more, and with Diane also, and with David. Being mainstreamed into a school system where there are hearing students, how were you expected to learn and get along and understand what the teacher was saying? Because I don't think your teacher you signed, did she or he?
No, they didn't. Well, when I was young, I went to a private school, and that gave me the idea of maybe sitting in the first row of the room and watching the teachers reading their lips. And I knew it was impossible. So what I did was I used my classmates' notes, and I always spoke with the teachers after class for help to catch up. Some teachers were easy to lip read, and others weren't so easy, so it really depended on the individual teacher. And it was really hard. It's a funny thing that I tell people, that I went through high school without an interpreter, and all the way through college without an interpreter. I read a lot, and worked very hard. And then in 1973, because of the 504 federal law that was passed requiring all schools to provide interpreters, for me it was wonderful, because it's just in time for my graduate studies. And I found it was so easy. I could just sit back and enjoy the class, and I didn't have to do so much outside studying. And so I always say that getting a PhD was easier than my other degrees.
But wouldn't you say that you are an exception to the rule as far as being able to succeed as much as you have in the deaf community? It just seems, I don't know, are you an exception to the rule?
Yes, I've been considered an exception But I always give the credit to my parents, who happen to have that 11 years of experience with my older brother. And that's why I wrote the book, The Silent Garden, because of what my mother said. If I only had that book, my mother said, I would have done it exactly the right way with the first deaf brother.
Has she read it?
Oh, yes. And I dedicated the book to her. Dedicated it to her, and it was nice for me to be able to do that. And I'd like to say something about David's background, and his situation is also unique because only 10% of parents of deaf children are deaf. So they're deaf people who are already experts, and that makes a big difference. Think about the 90% of the parents of deaf children who are hearing, and they know absolutely nothing about what to do, and all of a sudden a deaf baby comes along, and they go through a lot of emotional things because they have this vision of their child that becomes shattered. They wanted their child to be normal, and so they have to go through some very difficult times for themselves, and usually the child doesn't get the proper foundation, and the child suffers a lot. By the time the deaf child goes to school, the child is far behind in his education and communication, his communication level. That's why David's very fortunate to have deaf parents who knew what to do immediately. That made it very easy.
That's a good point, and I want to... Oh, David, did you want to say something?
Yes, my parents also had that sort of problem with their hearing parents who weren't ready for them. Their hearing parents had to go through hard times. And so I was very lucky that I didn't have that hard time.
Okay. I want to continue on the idea with the parents and the parents' role in all of this. And Diane, I'd like to address my next question to you. Now, working with deaf students in the school system, you must probably work with the parents. Do you see a lack of education on the part of the parents? Do they need to learn more?
Generally speaking, when we first meet the parents, they're just usually discovering at the very youngest ages that their child has a hearing loss. And so a lot of times they're going through the same stages just as if their child had died. They're going through the same grief process. And it's very interesting in working with them because what we need to do is to give them the support, to help to educate them on what they can do and the opportunities that are available for their children, because it's changed so much from years past. There are a lot of doors open. The educational system has changed a great deal. And we started 18 months old giving parent education classes. And so the children only come to school a small portion of their daily activity. And we allot the time for meeting with the parents, working with them, going out to their homes, and we have a set curriculum of things that we try to cover with all the parents.
Okay, I want, again, to follow up with the education process, and I would like to go to David and then Letitia next. As far as the education process, David, you, as Dr. Ogden had mentioned, were fortunate because your education started right away because your parents were deaf, so they knew how to teach you right away. Now tell us, you were in the public school systems for a while. Tell us about what you learned in the public school and how, because you were mainstreamed with hearing kids, correct? And how was that for you? Were you comfortable? Did you learn a lot? Explain that to us.
Okay. I was also in a total communication program with other deaf kids. Half of what they were learning I had already learned from my parents, so I was kind of in the top of that class, and so I was also mainstreamed with hearing kids. But sometimes I was more on the level with the other hearing kids. And I just went through the system as any normal hearing kid would and had an interpreter in front of me. It looks kind of easy for me, but it was a challenge. Because it's very difficult with an interpreter who there's always a lag time between what is said. And as a result, I didn't really raise my hand that often since it was such a hassle. And often I was in the back of the class and observing and never spoke my views, which was hard for me. I wanted so bad to be involved, but, you know, with I don't speak, so.
Did any of your teachers use sign language, or did you just were you responsible for just reading lips yourself and kind of figuring it out yourself?
Well, all the signing was left to the interpreter.
Okay.
The teachers didn't really know signs. But in the total communication program, we had teachers who were hearing and who signed.
Okay. And then before I get to Letitia, Steve, I'd like to ask you about that. I had mentioned earlier, and you had said that right now you teach 4th, 5th, and 6th grade students who are deaf. Tell us, now where were who taught these kids before they came to the 4th grade? I mean, what was their schooling from 1st through 3rd grade? Did they have a teacher like you to help them along?
They had teachers helping them along. The teachers were not like me. First of all of the teachers were women. Also, all of the teachers were hearing. Right now, I'm teaching in the oral program. Fresno Unified School District has really a special thing going on. They have programs for children that are growing up oral, like Dr. Ogden. And
Okay, when you say oral program, I don't know if I understand what you're saying, as far as oral and total communications.
I mean, the students are taught with a system called cued speech, which is meant to show them clearly what English is happening on the mouth, so that they can understand the English. Also, the hope is that they will grow up to vocalize and to speech read. I work with those students, and I think it's good for them to have a hearing impaired model. They know that I grew up hearing, but I've had parents come up to me in the past and ask me questions about what it feels like to be deaf in a way that shows that they understand there's some profound differences.
Now, Dr. Ogden, to follow up on what Steve said as far as teaching the children at this young age to learn to vocalize. Now, you had said that you were born deaf, so you never heard a word before, but you do have some vocalization. Do you feel that that's important, that children learn to vocalize?
Well, that question is very controversial in the field of deafness. I would have to say that many deaf children don't benefit fully from the pure oral program. You have to evaluate each deaf child, because some can speak and some can't. And it's really difficult sometimes. In the past 100 years, teachers of the deaf have tended to make all deaf students learn how to speak and sacrifice their education in the regular school subjects. Just forget everything and go with speech first. That was very common in the past, but now things have changed so much in the past 10 or 15 years, and it's very different. teachers tend to decide which child should have more speech training than other children. So it all depends on the child. And I think a lot of big changes have been made in the past 10 years, which have been a big challenge for Diane, who's the program specialist trying to provide the best education for every child in the whole school system. Because some are being mainstreamed, and that costs a certain amount of money, and there's budget limitations. Other children prefer to stay with the other deaf children in classes, so it's complicated.
So like we said in the beginning, there are still a lot of struggles that we're trying to overcome in the deaf community. And I mentioned one of them was the protest at Gallaudet University this fall. And before I go to Letitia with my next question, we have a film clip that we'd like to show our viewing audience to tell you a little bit about what this protest was all about and how it happened. And let's take a look at that right now.
I want to talk about our first rally. A crowd of about 1,000 to 2,000 deaf people were screaming in support of a deaf president. There had never been one in 124 years. The Board of Trustees claimed they were acting in Gallaudet University's best interest, but many of the people didn't believe that and didn't trust them. I had been feeling positive, and I was unprepared for the worst because I thought the board would act in the best interest of Gallaudet University. Then on Sunday, the moment drew nearer. At about 7:15 or 7:30, the members of the Board of Trustees made their announcement. It was like we'd been punched right in the face. We couldn't believe that Zinsser had been chosen as our 7th hearing president. It couldn't be true. Our spirits sank. Obviously, they didn't understand how we felt. But then we started really getting angry.
We picked Dr. Elizabeth Ann Zinsser as the 7th president of Gallaudet. Was because she is a very talented educator.
The board has chosen a hearing president, preventing deaf people from getting what they want. They want to bring deaf people down. When deaf people prepare to succeed, hearing people bring them down.
They're still afraid that deaf people can't do it. That's what I believe. They're afraid.
We will get the information out that this is the greatest insult to deaf people of America. 26 million of them, and they are disgusted. No question about it. And I do not intend to sit back. We'll have an organizational meeting tonight to discuss what we will do about it. This shows that we are not the ones who are really deaf, but it is they, the board, who are deaf.
Okay, now Letitia, a lot of emotions that we felt just by watching that 3-minute clip there, and you were there. Tell us how you felt when that appointment was made, the hearing president was selected. How were you, obviously we can see how the students were feeling, but you personally?
Well, at first, when they made the announcement that the president chosen was hearing, I was just kind of, dumbfounded. Why is everyone complaining about that? And then I kept asking my friends, and it finally hit me what the point of it was. And then the rally started. And then, I was really excited about trying to get a deaf president, and I became very involved in the struggle.
Did the students, did your student body think that they would really be able, they got all of their demands. Their demands were that a deaf president be elected, the president that was new in office, that she resign, also that Spillman resign, and also that none of the students were arrested. Now, did the student body feel that they would get all of those, or were you all surprised when it finally happened and all your demands were met?
Well, at first, with the 4 demands, the students who set those up felt that they really could go through it, and they felt like, really like hamming through a wall. That they could do it, that they could get it, and and we did do it.
So you must have felt pretty good.
Oh yes, wow! It was really inspiring. We were all crying and felt really positive that it was a big moment in history. And we also took advantage of that moment to get publicity to the hearing world. And some of my hearing friends have asked me where I'm going to school, and I say Gallaudet University, and before they hadn't known where, but now they all know where I'm going.
That is so true.
Yeah, so we took advantage of that publicity.
Now you're going to be you were in a year of prep school at Gallaudet. In the fall, you're going to be a freshman. What are some of your goals once you graduate 4 years from Gallaudet? What are you looking at?
Well, I'd like to be an economics teacher, or set up a business or something related to finances.
And let's talk a little bit about jobs. And Pam, as I mentioned, you worked helping place deaf people in jobs. And like I mentioned in the beginning, one of the most simple questions is how do deaf people interview for a job? Obviously, unfortunately, there is a stumbling block for them. So how do they overcome that?
I think that the interviewing is several steps ahead of where the deaf individual needs to start. There are so many of the deaf individuals who get out into the world, have graduated from high school, and now they want to work, and they have difficulty even filling out an application. So there's a lot of programs, things going on now in the high school programs here, in other service agencies such as VACC, California Association for the Physically Handicapped, that are trying to give deaf individuals those basic skills first, getting through an application process. Then the next step would be basically learning how to utilize an interpreter for the interview process. But a lot of times for the deaf individual, it does require some intervention just to get past the door, because a deaf person walks into a job and the hearing person politely says, "Thank you," and it goes in the trash. And that's the reality of still what's happening today. Agencies such as ours and some of the community service agencies are involved in advocating for the deaf individual. And that's an important thing, I think, that still needs to happen. Not that deaf individuals are not capable of doing things on their own, but because there's still so much ignorance that prevails in the community. An example might be a deaf individual who wants to work in a warehouse. And they think, oh my goodness, they can't possibly. What if something falls off the top shelf? The deaf person will never hear that. But there are so many things the deaf individual can do. Years ago, when my mother and father were in that position, graduating from high school and college and looking for work, there wasn't the option of Social Security, supplemental security income. They had to work. If they didn't work, there was no bread and butter on the table. There was no food to feed the family. Nowadays, there's an option of collecting money from the government, so that makes it more difficult and challenging to get the deaf individual into the workplace. But I think advocates and interpreters are an important link to the community, and education, and telling people that the deafness is not something that has to prevent them from working. Let them have opportunities to work.
Right, and Diane, go ahead.
There's also a lot that has to happen within the school system and the family system as they're growing up, because when to start training for jobs and work ethics and all those things is not after they graduate high school. It's got to start at the very youngest ages, at the elementary level, and talking to them about different vocations that are available. So much come to hearing children without people realizing what's happening. They hear the family conversation of Dad's going to work and he's going to be doing this today and this happened at work and that caused problems. They miss all of those dynamics that happen in the home because they don't hear that information, and many times out in the homes the families aren't able to fluently communicate with their children, so the children miss all of that. And so the school system then needs to be working with the families and also in the daily routine of doing things, showing them what work ethics are, coming to class on time, bringing the pencil and paper. I mean, we're talking the real basics, but then relating that how it's important that they have to do those things in the job also. And what do they do if they're deaf and they're not going to be able to get to work on time or they're late? They've got to learn to use a TDD. Those skills all need to be taught before they get out into work field.
Right, and also some of the new techniques in teaching the deaf. You had mentioned before we even went on air that the school system is implementing some new technology that is helping these deaf students, correct?
One of the exciting things that I see happening is that for the first time in many years, we've been given what they call low incidence funds. And it's kind of nice for me to feel like my tax dollars are going directly to kids. We're getting what we call auditory trainers. We've had them before, but they were old and they had gotten so old they really weren't useful anymore. So we're buying new equipment so that the children will be able to hear the sounds directly from the teacher's voice to their ear. They can hear more clearly because hearing aids are not selective in what they amplify. If you think of yourself in a classroom, you hear the hearing aid amplifies the shuffling of the papers, the banging of the desk, as well as the teacher's voice. And so it's real important for them to hear the teacher's voice as well. So they see the teacher's signs and the voice, and that's all happening. So we've got that equipment. We're getting equipment in the area of phonics to check the hearing aids, because it's not like glasses. You can put them on, you can tell when glasses aren't working, if they're cracked or something. Hearing aids, you put them on and you don't know the difference unless you're that person or you have some kind of mechanical way of checking it. So we're getting very expensive equipment in the school systems to check all those things for them now.
Okay. I'd like to go to David next, just because there's so much more I still want to ask, and I know we're getting close to the end of the show. David, tell us the atmosphere at Fremont, where you're at now, the school. It's all deaf students and all deaf teachers. Do you feel that that is the best atmosphere for a deaf student to be in, or do you feel that you're missing something by not being mainstreamed with hearing teachers and students?
Okay, well, at school, all the students are either hard of hearing or deaf, and we have some deaf teachers, some who are very skilled in signing American Sign Language, and we have good communication. And the atmosphere at school is very different than a public school for me, because I'm directly involved, and I can go one-on-one directly to the teacher and have that straight involvement. It was a little shock for me because I hadn't felt free in class, in the social atmosphere after school and whatnot in public schools. But and finally I had coaches who would sign, and I could play football, and here at public schools you can't bring an interpreter to football practice, but there's no problem in Fremont. I don't feel like I'm missing out in the hearing world because I am being mainstreamed into one English class right now with other hearing kids at a school nearby. So I get a taste of that too.
Okay, Dr. Ogden, what is your viewpoint on the diversity, I don't know if that's the right word to say, in the educational system, whereas we have the new technology in the public school system that is helping deaf students and is mainstreaming them with hearing teachers and students, and yet, as in David's example, we have Fremont, where it's mostly a deaf community that he's engaging with. What is your opinion on that type of teaching and education for our students?
Well, it goes back to the question of it depends on the individual. Each family has to decide. Sometimes some children prefer to stay and go to the public school. Some prefer to go to the residential school. Depends on the child and the family. And it's a really tough question to answer.
Okay, Steve, what do you feel about that? Well, what is your opinion on that? Seeing the fact that you can, I think, objectively judge both sides of the issue because of given your situation.
I agree with Dr. Ogden. I think the parents have to decide for their child. But I think that many parents are open-minded enough to make changes when it's appropriate. And I'm glad to see that. You see me signing, but in my classroom I don't sign. I use a little bit different system called Cute Speech. And really, it's appropriate for each different child to have different programs available.
And again, as Diane had mentioned, a lot of it is the education of the parents. And you want to make a comment?
Well, one of the very important elements very early on in the child's education is to educate the parents. What is a total communication program? What does that involve? What commitment does that take on their part? What will their child benefit from it? Because most parents, almost all parents will say, if I ask them, what do you want for your child? I want him to be just normal. I want him to be able to talk. I want the same aspirations any other parent wants. I want him to succeed, get a job. They have all those aspirations. And so it's educating them what choices, what options do they have as parents. Because in Fresno, we're lucky. We're the fourth largest school district in California. So we serve Fresno County as well as Fresno Unified students. And we're able to group them in such a way they have a choice between total communication and also an oral program which uses the Cute Speech philosophy also in it. And giving them the choice is a real luxury, because many parts of California, for a while, all the programs were oral. Then they become very much more total communication. And you've seen many of the oral programs non-existent because they can't offer both. I mean, the program's not large enough. And so in Fresno, I feel like we're very, very fortunate.
Okay, Pam?
Just real briefly, they talked about, the parents making the decision, but I've also been fortunate to see situations where the parent and the child, the teacher and a counselor, have been able to sit down and decide as a group. And it's inspirational to see parents allowing the student to have a say, that his feelings are important. And I think that's important for us as a community as well, to be sensitive to the deaf individual and recognize that they're people with feelings and that their voice is just as important as anyone else's.
That's right. And again, I want to get back to David really briefly. You're going to be a sophomore at Fremont. Sophomore or junior?
Sophomore.
Okay, so you have 2 more years to go. What are some of your career goals after you graduate from high school? Have you thought about that yet?
Well, I feel time's running out fast, and I have to make some decisions on those goals, but I really don't know. I like writing, but I really don't know. We'll have to. I'd like to be a big role model in the deaf community, for one.
Are you looking at Gallaudet University?
Oh, yes, of course.
So when you're a freshman, Letitia, you'll be a senior, right? So maybe we'll see each other there. Okay.
Of course.
Also, before we go, because again we only have a few minutes, Pam, if people would like to get in touch with you and your program regarding job placement and would like to just talk with you about it, where can they call?
There are two numbers. There's a voice number and there's also a TDD number. The voice number is 486-0834. The TDD number is 486-0837.
Okay, good. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. We are out of time. Unfortunately, I know we could all sit and talk for another hour. We probably will once the lights go out. And Steve, we want to thank Obi. I think Obi slept through the whole show. So I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. And hopefully we have enlightened some people in our community, deaf and hearing, as to the goals and everything that the deaf community wants to achieve. And like Pam said, their voice is just as important, whether we can hear it or not. I don't think that is the point or the issue here. So thank all of you for being here. And I also want to mention to our viewing audience a program that Channel 18 will be airing beginning tomorrow, and it's a 4-part series called Deaf and Blind, and it starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Now, the first segment profiles the blind, and that's tomorrow night, but next Friday, July 22nd, deaf students at the School for the Deaf at the Alabama Institute will be featured. And right now, we're going to show you a promo that will tell you a little bit more about that.
You say, hello. Hello. O. A. B. C. D. E. E. Where's E?
When you live in a world without sound, even learning your ABCs isn't as simple as ABC.
Say you're angry. Say the truth, how you feel.
I didn't punish him like I did the other kids, and then the doctor told me one day, he said, you have to be more firm with him and more strict with him than you do the other kids. He said, he's not a handicap. He said, you're making him a handicap.
Share the struggles, the triumphs, the laughter, and the tears as award-winning filmmaker Frederick Wiseman's Deaf and Blind continues with a look at the deaf.
See you later, alligator. See you later, crocodile.
Again, that program is today, July 22nd, and it begins at 8 p.m. And also, I want to thank Kathy Yoshida, staff interpreter at VACC, for being with us this evening, and also Brian Riley for interpreting and signing for myself and for our guests here tonight. And for all of the staff here at Channel 18, thank you for watching. I'm Carol Sikorsky. Good night. Stay tuned to Channel 18. One by One is next at 8 o'clock. Information on the Valley Advocacy and getting in touch with any of our interpreters from this evening, you can call Brian Riley at 268-4144 or Kathy Yoshida at 299-8643.
We did it last summer. We can do it again.